Sarah Martinez never thought she would end up in Afghanistan. Growing up in a small Texas town, she had always been the girl who helped injured animals and bandaged her younger brother's scraped knees. When she joined the Army at 19, her family thought she would work safely in a military hospital somewhere in the United States. They never imagined she would be running through gunfire in the mountains of Afghanistan, carrying a medical bag that felt heavier than her own body weight. The morning started like any other at Forward Operating Base Chapman. Sarah woke up at 5 in the morning to the sound of helicopters landing and taking off. She had been in Afghanistan for 8 months now, and the sounds of war had become as normal as birds chirping back home. She rolled out of her narrow cot, put on her desert camouflage uniform, and checked her medical supplies. Every morning she counted bandages, morphine shots, and tourniquets. In this place, being prepared could mean the difference between life and death for someone. Sarah was part of Bravo Company, a unit that worked closely with Navy SEALs on dangerous missions. Most of the soldiers were men who had been in the military for years. At first, they looked at her like she was their little sister who had wandered into the wrong place. But after she saved 3 soldiers during an ambush 2 months ago, they started calling her Doc with real respect in their voices. She had proven that being small and young did not mean she could not handle the worst situations. The mission briefing came at 7 in the morning. Captain Rodriguez stood in front of a map covered with red marks showing enemy positions. The target was a Taliban stronghold in the mountains about 20 miles from their base. Intelligence reports said the enemy had kidnapped 2 American contractors and was holding them in a compound surrounded by high walls and armed guards. The mission was simple on paper but dangerous in reality. Get in, rescue the hostages, get out. Sarah listened carefully as the SEAL commander, Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison, explained the plan. Morrison was a tall man with serious gray eyes who had been leading special operations for over 10 years. He had a reputation for bringing his people home alive, no matter how bad things got. When he looked at Sarah, she saw something in his eyes that made her stand a little straighter. He was counting on her, just like everyone else on the team. The team would fly in on 2 helicopters and land about a mile from the target. They would have to hike through rocky terrain while staying hidden from enemy scouts. Sarah would stay close to the middle of the group, ready to help anyone who got hurt. She had done this kind of mission before, but something felt different this time. Maybe it was the way Morrison kept checking his weapon, or how quiet the usually joking soldiers had become. Everyone seemed to know this mission would test them in ways they had never been tested before. As they loaded onto the helicopters, Sarah felt the familiar mix of fear and determination that came before every dangerous mission. She touched the small cross her grandmother had given her, whispered a quick prayer, and checked her medical kit one more time. In a few hours, she would be in the middle of a firefight that would change everything she thought she knew about herself and about war. The helicopter engines roared to life, and Sarah closed her eyes, trying to calm her racing heart as they lifted off into the Afghan sky. The helicopters flew low through the mountain valleys, following the rough terrain to avoid enemy radar. Sarah gripped her seat as the aircraft bounced through the turbulent air. Through the small window, she could see the jagged peaks of the Hindu Kush Mountains, stretching endlessly in every direction. The landscape looked like something from another planet, all brown rock and deep shadows with no signs of life anywhere. After 30 minutes of flying, the pilot's voice crackled through their headsets. They were approaching the landing zone. Sarah felt her stomach drop as the helicopter suddenly descended toward a small clearing surrounded by boulders. The moment the aircraft touched down, everyone moved with practiced efficiency. Within seconds, 12 heavily armed soldiers and Sarah were running across the rocky ground toward cover. The landing zone was eerily quiet. Too quiet. Morrison held up his fist, signaling everyone to stop and listen. Sarah crouched behind a large rock, her heart pounding so loud she was sure the enemy could hear it from miles away. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours but was probably only a few minutes. Then Morrison gave the signal to move forward, and the team began their careful advance toward the target compound. The hike through the mountains was exhausting. The thin air at high altitude made every step feel like running upstairs while wearing a heavy backpack. Sarah's medical kit, which weighed about 40 pounds, seemed to get heavier with each step. Sweat poured down her face despite the cool mountain air, but she kept up with the team, refusing to slow them down or ask for help carrying her gear. As they got closer to the target, they started finding signs of the enemy. Fresh footprints in the dirt, cigarette butts that were still warm, Empty water bottles. Morrison studied each clue carefully, using hand signals to communicate what he found to the rest of the team. Sarah realized they were walking into a much larger enemy force than intelligence had reported. Instead of a dozen guards, there might be 50 or more Taliban fighters waiting for them. When they reached a ridge overlooking the compound, Morrison pulled out his binoculars and studied the target for a long time. Sarah could see the worried expression on his face even though he tried to hide it. The compound was bigger than expected, with multiple buildings surrounded by high concrete walls. Armed guards walked patrol routes around the perimeter, and there were sandbag positions with heavy machine guns at each corner. Morrison gathered his team leaders for a quick conference. Sarah was close enough to hear parts of their whispered conversation. The mission had changed from a quick rescue to something much more dangerous. They were outnumbered at least 4-1, and the compound was better defended than anyone had expected. But the hostages were definitely inside. Through his binoculars, Morrison had seen 2 men in American clothing being moved between buildings under guard. The decision was made to proceed with the mission despite the increased danger. They had come too far to turn back now, and every hour they waited increased the chances that the hostages would be moved or killed. Morrison looked directly at Sarah and spoke quietly but firmly. She needed to be ready for casualties. This was not going to be a clean operation where everyone walked away uninjured. People were going to get hurt, and some might not make it home at all. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the compound, Sarah checked her medical supplies one more time. She had enough bandages and morphine for maybe 6 serious injuries, but she had a feeling she was going to need a lot more than that. The team prepared for their assault, and Sarah said another prayer, this time asking not just for safety but for the strength to save as many lives as possible in the chaos that was about to begin. The attack began at exactly 9 o'clock at night. Morrison had divided his team into 3 groups that would hit the compound from different directions at the same time. The plan was to create confusion and overwhelm the defenders before they could organize a proper defense. Sarah was assigned to the main assault team that would breach the front gate, while the other 2 groups attacked from the sides. Everything went wrong within the first 30 seconds. As soon as the team moved out of the shadows toward the compound walls, bright spotlights suddenly blazed to life, turning night into day. Someone inside the compound started shouting in Pashto, and the sound of automatic weapons filled the air. The Taliban had been expecting them. This was not a rescue mission anymore. It was a trap. Sarah dropped to the ground as bullets whistled over her head, chipping pieces of rock from the boulders around her. The noise was incredible, like being inside a thunderstorm where the thunder never stopped. She could hear Morrison shouting orders over the gunfire, but she could not make out the words. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness like deadly fireworks as both sides exchanged fire. The first casualty happened less than a minute into the fight. Sergeant Williams, a tough soldier from Detroit who had always joked with Sarah about her cooking, suddenly cried out and fell backward. Sarah saw dark blood spreading across his chest armor. Without thinking, she grabbed her medical bag and crawled toward him on her hands and knees while bullets cracked through the air, just inches above her head. Williams was conscious, but struggling to breathe. A bullet had hit him just below his protective vest, and Sarah could see that he was bleeding internally. She worked quickly in the darkness, using her hands to feel for the wound since she could not risk using a flashlight. Her medical training took over and her hands moved automatically, applying pressure to stop the bleeding and injecting morphine to ease his pain. While Sarah worked on Williams, the battle around them grew more intense. The Taliban fighters had the advantage of high ground and prepared positions, while Morrison's team was pinned down in the open with limited cover. She could hear more soldiers calling for medic help from different directions, but she could not leave Williams or he would die within minutes. Morrison appeared beside her like a ghost, moving in a low crouch. His face was streaked with dirt and sweat, and there was a fierce determination in his eyes that Sarah had never seen before. He took one look at Williams and understood immediately how serious the wound was. Without saying a word, he helped Sarah drag the injured soldier behind a larger boulder that provided better protection from the enemy fire. As Sarah continued treating Williams, she became aware of a new sound cutting through the chaos of battle. It was the deep, rhythmic pounding of a heavy machine gun, much larger than anything the other soldiers were carrying. The sound sent chills down her spine because she recognized it from her training. It was a .50 caliber machine gun, a weapon so powerful it could punch through concrete walls and destroy vehicles with a single shot. Morrison had been carrying the massive weapon as his primary gun, but now he was helping Sarah save Williams instead of using it to fight back against the enemy. The Taliban fighters seemed to realize that the American team's most dangerous weapon had gone silent, and they began advancing from their positions, moving closer through the darkness. Sarah could hear their voices getting louder as they approached. She looked up from Williams to see Morrison staring at the .50 caliber machine gun lying beside them. She could see the terrible choice he was facing. He could either continue helping her save one soldier's life, or he could pick up his weapon and fight to save the entire team. In that moment, Sarah realized that everything they had trained for, everything they believed about duty and sacrifice, was about to be tested in the most extreme way possible. The next few minutes would determine whether any of them would make it home alive. Sarah could see the agony in Morrison's eyes as he looked between Williams, who was barely breathing, and the advancing enemy fighters. The .50 caliber machine gun lay between them like a sleeping giant, its massive barrel catching the light from the enemy spotlights. She had never touched a weapon that large before. As a medic, her job was to save lives, not take them. But everything was changing in ways she had never imagined possible. Morrison made his decision with the kind of clarity that only comes in life or death moments. He looked directly at Sarah, and in a voice that was calm despite the chaos around them, he said something that would echo in her mind for the rest of her life. "Doc, I need you to take this weapon. Williams needs both my hands to survive, and the team needs that gun firing, or we are all dead." Sarah stared at the massive machine gun. It looked like something that belonged on a tank, not in the hands of a small medic from Texas. The weapon was almost as long as she was tall and probably weighed more than her entire medical kit. She had trained with standard rifles in basic training, but this was something completely different. This was a weapon designed to destroy everything it pointed at. The sound of enemy voices was getting closer. Sarah could hear boots crunching on gravel as Taliban fighters moved through the darkness toward their position. Morrison was working frantically on Williams, using both hands to apply pressure to internal bleeding, while trying to start an IV line in the dim light. Every few seconds he would glance up at Sarah with an expression that said more than words ever could. The team's survival depended on her willingness to become something she had never been before. Sarah's hands were shaking as she reached for the machine gun. The moment her fingers wrapped around the grip, she felt the weight of everyone's lives pressing down on her shoulders. This was not just a weapon. It was the difference between her friends going home to their families or dying in this rocky wasteland thousands of miles from everything they loved. Morrison quickly explained how to operate the gun while still working on Williams. The safety switch, how to change the barrel if it overheated, where to load the ammunition. His voice was patient and professional, as if he were teaching her how to use a piece of medical equipment instead of a weapon of war. But Sarah could hear the urgency underneath his calm tone. They were running out of time. The first Taliban fighter appeared around the edge of a boulder about 50 yards away. Sarah saw the muzzle flash from his rifle before she heard the crack of the bullet passing close to her head. Without thinking, she swung the heavy machine gun toward the threat and pulled the trigger. The gun roared to life with a sound like thunder, and she watched in shock as the powerful bullets tore chunks of rock from the boulder where the enemy fighter had been hiding. The recoil from the .50 caliber was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. It felt like being punched in the shoulder by a professional boxer while holding onto a jackhammer. The gun wanted to climb up and to the right with each shot, and she had to fight to keep it pointed at the target. But somehow, through a combination of determination and beginner's luck, she was hitting where she aimed. The effect on the enemy was immediate and dramatic. The Taliban fighters, who had been advancing confidently just moments before, suddenly found themselves under fire from one of the most feared weapons in the American arsenal. The .50 caliber bullets could penetrate their cover and destroy their weapons with single shots. Within seconds, their organized advance turned into a chaotic retreat as they scrambled to find better hiding places. Morrison looked up from Williams with an expression of amazement and pride. "Keep firing, Doc," he shouted over the noise. "You are buying us the time we need." Sarah nodded and continued operating the massive weapon, feeling a strange mix of terror and empowerment. She was still the same person who had wanted to save lives and help people. But now she was learning that sometimes, saving the lives of good people meant being willing to fight against those who would harm them. For 20 minutes, Sarah held the Taliban fighters at bay with the .50 caliber machine gun, while Morrison worked to stabilize Williams. The weapon grew hot in her hands and her shoulders ached from controlling the massive recoil, but she never stopped firing. Every time an enemy fighter tried to advance or set up a new position, Sarah would send a burst of heavy rounds in their direction, forcing them back into cover. The other members of Morrison's team began to rally around Sarah's position. They had been scattered and pinned down when the ambush started, but the sound of the .50 caliber gave them hope and direction. One by one, soldiers appeared out of the darkness, moving carefully from boulder to boulder until they formed a defensive perimeter around Sarah and Morrison. Corporal Jackson, a demolitions expert from Louisiana, crawled up beside Sarah with a wild grin on his face. "Doc, I have never been so happy to hear that big gun firing," he shouted over the noise. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" Sarah shook her head, too focused on the fight to explain that she was making it up as she went along. Every shot was a learning experience, and somehow she was getting better at controlling the weapon with each burst of fire. Morrison finished his work on Williams and looked up with relief in his eyes. "He is stable for now, but we need to get him to a hospital within the hour or he won't make it," he said. The problem was that they were still surrounded by enemy fighters and their planned escape route was blocked. The helicopters could not land under fire, and the team could not move Williams without exposing him to more danger. That was when Sarah heard the sound that changed everything. From somewhere inside the compound there was a different kind of gunfire. Single shots, very precise, coming from an American rifle. One of the other assault teams had made it inside the walls and was fighting their way toward the hostages. But they were outnumbered and would not last long without support. Morrison studied the situation through his binoculars and made a command decision that surprised everyone. "We are going to assault the compound," he announced. "Jackson, can you blow a hole in that wall?" The demolitions expert nodded eagerly. "Doc," Morrison continued, looking at Sarah, "I need you to keep that .50 cal firing to cover our advance. Can you do that?" Sarah looked at the massive weapon in her hands, then at Williams lying unconscious beside her, then at the faces of the soldiers who were counting on her. 6 months ago she had been treating scraped knees and helping with homework. Now she was being asked to provide cover fire for an assault on an enemy stronghold. The transformation felt impossible, but somehow it also felt natural, as if this moment had been waiting for her all along. The assault began with Jackson's explosives blowing a massive hole in the compound wall. The sound was deafening, and chunks of concrete flew through the air like deadly rain. As soon as the dust settled, Morrison led his team through the breach while Sarah provided covering fire with the .50 caliber. She aimed for the guard towers and weapon positions, trying to suppress enemy fire long enough for her friends to get inside. What followed was the most intense 30 minutes of Sarah's life. She moved the heavy machine gun from position to position, always staying close enough to Williams to protect him, but mobile enough to support the assault team. The weapon grew so hot that steam rose from the barrel, and she had to change it twice to prevent a malfunction. Her hands were blistered from gripping the hot metal and her ears were ringing from the constant noise. But slowly, incredibly, the plan was working. The combination of Sarah's covering fire and the assault team's advance was overwhelming the Taliban defenders. She could hear American voices inside the compound now, shouting coordinates and calling for backup. The hostages had been found, and the rescue was actually succeeding. Against all odds, Morrison's decision to trust a young medic with his most powerful weapon was saving the day. The rescue helicopters arrived just as the sun began to rise over the mountains. Sarah had been firing the .50 caliber machine gun for almost 2 hours, and her entire body ached from the strain. But when she heard the distinctive sound of American helicopters approaching, she felt a surge of relief that almost brought tears to her eyes. They had done it. Against impossible odds, they had rescued the hostages and were all going home. Morrison emerged from the compound with the 2 rescued contractors, both of whom were injured but alive. Behind him came the rest of the assault team, carrying 3 wounded soldiers on stretchers. The mission had been successful, but the cost had been high. Sarah immediately shifted back into her role as a medic, checking each wounded man and prioritizing their treatment for the helicopter ride back to base. Williams was still unconscious, but stable, Sarah's quick treatment in the middle of the firefight had saved his life, and Morrison made sure she knew it. "If you hadn't been here tonight, we would have lost him," he said quietly as they loaded Williams onto the helicopter. "But more than that, if you hadn't picked up that gun when I asked you to, we would have lost everyone." As the helicopters lifted off from the landing zone, Sarah finally allowed herself to think about what had happened. She looked down at her hands, which were still stained with Williams' blood and marked with blisters from operating the machine gun. These hands had saved a life and taken enemy fire in the same night. She was still a medic, still someone who wanted to heal and help others, but she was also something more now, something she had never expected to become. The flight back to base gave Sarah time to process the emotions that had been pushed aside during the fight. She felt proud of what she had accomplished, but also confused about how natural it had felt to use a weapon in combat. She thought about her family back in Texas and wondered what they would think if they knew their little girl had spent the night operating a .50 caliber machine gun in a firefight with Taliban fighters. Morrison sat beside her during the flight, occasionally checking on the wounded soldiers but mostly just thinking about the night's events. Finally, he turned to Sarah and spoke in a voice that only she could hear over the helicopter noise. "You know what you did tonight was extraordinary, right? Most soldiers with years of combat experience would have struggled with what I asked you to do. You saved lives tonight, Doc, both with your medical skills and with that gun." When they landed at the base, news of the mission had already spread. Sarah found herself surrounded by soldiers who wanted to hear about the night when a medic had operated a .50 caliber machine gun in combat. She felt uncomfortable with the attention at first, but gradually she began to understand that her story was important. It showed that in extreme situations, people could become more than they ever thought possible. William survived his injuries and made a full recovery. 6 months later, when Sarah's deployment ended and she was preparing to return to the United States, he came to thank her personally. "I owe you my life twice over," he said with genuine emotion. "Once for the medical treatment that kept me alive, and once for picking up that gun when the commander needed you to. Most people would have frozen up, but you stepped up when it mattered most." Looking back on that night, Sarah realized it had changed her in ways that went far beyond learning how to operate a heavy weapon. She had discovered that being a healer and being a protector were not opposite things. Sometimes protecting innocent people meant being willing to fight against those who would harm them. She returned home to Texas with a deeper understanding of service, sacrifice, and the complexity of doing good in a dangerous world. Years later, when people asked Sarah about her time in Afghanistan, she would always mention that night in the mountains, not because she was proud of using a weapon in combat, but because it taught her that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when the lives of others depended on their courage. She remained a medic for the rest of her military career, but she was never again just a medic. She was someone who had proven that when everything was on the line, she would do whatever it took to bring her people home alive.